Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are going to be taking a look at the European Team Chess Championship being held in Budva, Montenegro. Now, as you guys know, we've been following the trials and travails of the Norwegian team featuring the former world chess champion Magnus Carlsen. So it's been a tough event for Norway, but let's see if Magnus can get back on the right track. So first game we're going to be taking a look at is a game which is played between Jonas Buhl-Bjerre and Magnus Carlsen. Now, Jonas Buhl-Bjerre is a very strong player from Denmark, rated 2633. A couple of years back, I remember hearing about him as potentially being the next Magnus Carlsen. Now, his rating has stalled out a little bit. Nonetheless, we have a battle of the Scandinavians, and we'll see if Magnus Carlsen can prove that he is the best Scandinavian, let alone the best player in the world in this game. So let's jump into the action. The game starts with e4. We get knight to c6 from Magnus, knight to f3, and now we have this move d6 being played. Now, I actually played this move knight c6 on move one a couple of times against Rustam Kasimdzhanov from Uzbekistan in the past. The problem with this move is that if white plays d4, d5, and you get the classic Nimzovich system, this can be quite playable for black, even if the computer doesn't love it that much. But if white goes knight to f3, black is already in a tough spot, because if you play the move d5 here, for example, after takes, because you brought the knight out to c6, after white goes knight to c3, queen to a5, d4, let's just say you go bishop g4, intending to castle and pressure the pawn in the center immediately. After white plays bishop b5, black is already significantly worse, and this is still considered theory, but not the good kind of theory for the player with the black pieces. So Magnus plays d6, we get the move d4 being played. Now we have knight to f6, knight c3, and Magnus decides to play the modern system with d6 and g6. Bjerre plays d5, we get knight b8, bishop e2, bishop g7, castles, and now both sides have castled their pieces and they've developed to some degree, but Magnus has his knight on b8 and white has taken a little bit of space in the center of the board. So we get h3 here, a logical move. It stops black from moving this light square bishop. Normally what black would love to do here is play something like bishop g4, trade off the bishop for the knight, bring the knight into the game. Let's just say bishop e2, rook c8, rook e1, and c6. And now black is a very comfortable position here. You're opening up the c file. You've got a lot of scope, a lot of pressure on the center of the board, and black should be fine. So Bjerre plays h3, cutting off the bishop from going to g4. Magnus plays c6 anyway. We get a4 here. Now the reason behind playing a4 is basically to take away this b5 move from black. If black could ever say get a move like b5 and potentially b4 here, you would undermine the knight on c3 and you would win some material in the center of the board. So in this position, we get a4, Magnus plays a5, we get rook to e1, Magnus plays knight to a6, and now we see the drawback behind putting this pawn in a4, as black has access to both the c5 and the b4 squares. So we get bishop f1, knight to b4 played by Magnus, hooking the knight on b4. We have a little bit of a temporary bastion. If white could remove the knight, for example, and go c3, the knight would have to go back. So Bjerre plays bishop g5 here, intending to maybe move the queen, move the rook, but mainly just to figure out what's happening in the center of the board. So Magnus goes bishop d7, we get queen to d2, rook to c8, and now Bjerre makes a mistake with this g3 move. In this position, what Bjerre should have done was traded on c6, because after bishop c6 and knight d4, knight d7, it's very much in the spirit of a Sicilian now. Black has this great knight on b4, which is pressuring the pawn on c2, but after white plays a move like knight c6, takes, and rook a d1, knight c5, it looks like these knights are very active and aggressive here, but white can simply go knight b1 with the idea of c3, kicking the knight out of b4. White rook on e1 guards the pawn on e4, and black is in a lot of trouble. Instead, Bjerre plays g3 here, which is not a very good move, as it's inviting black to go on the offensive. So Magnus trades the pawns on d5, goes rook to c5, pressuring this pawn on d5 multiple times here, and now Bjerre plays this move bishop e3, and Magnus sacks the rook with rook takes c3 here. We get b takes c3, and now this great move knight to e4, and suddenly this has turned into an amazing Sicilian for Magnus Carlsen. He's got the active knights, he's got the active b's as well, and it looks like Bjerre has no development with the queen and the rooks on the back rank. So queen c1 played, knight takes c3 by Magnus. Now both a4 and d5 are hanging. We have bishop to d4. Magnus plays knight takes d5. We get the trade, and now we have this move bishop c4. Now black has equalized the material. He's got a knight and two pawns, but more importantly, white has a lot of weaknesses. The pawn on a4 is a big weakness. The pawn on h3 is a big weakness, and even sometimes the light square diagonal could be a big problem here, because white cannot fianchetto the bishop to g2. So we get e6 from Magnus. Bjerre plays bishop takes knight. we get pawn takes bishop. If black were to take with a knight, for example, now after c4, and let's just say knight f6 here, white can go c5, trying to trade off some pawns. If you play d5, there are multiple bastions in the center of the board. If you ever trade here, for example, and say you get this position, now white will be able to bring the rooks to some open files here, and white should not be worse. So Magnus takes with the pawn instead. Basically same idea, keep pressure on the pawn in a4, keep the wooden shield in play. Also, you have queen f6 to hit the knight and create the classic right triangle. So Pierre plays knight d4, Magnus goes queen to f6, hitting the knight. We get queen to e3 here, rook c8 played by Magnus, guarding the knight on c3. And now Pierre plays rook a3, and here Magnus goes knight to e4, retreating the knight, trying to target the pawns on f2 and g3. So after knight to e4, we get rook to d1 being played here by Pierre, a move that's intended to guard the knight on d4 so that white can maybe move the queen away. Now in this position, Magnus Carlsen plays this move rook to c4, which is still not the end of the world, but the computer does like bishop takes h3 instead. Now one problem, or I should say one of the issues sometimes top players in modern day chess have, is that they try to win games and keep full control over the position without ever allowing any counterplay. So what I mean by that is the idea is to not give your opponent any chances to create counterplay, mess up the board, make it a little bit complicated, and you want to win with no chances being given to your opponent. But in this case, you kind of have to potentially let white get some counterplay when you take the pawn. Now, probably the main reason Magnus did not take this pawn is he probably saw the boogeyman here. He probably thought white could go something like f3. If you go knight c5 and g4, suddenly the bishop on h3, a little bit trapped here on the side of the board, not so great. However, after knight takes pawn at f4, on first glance you're like, uh-oh, spaghetti-o, everything is guarded here, white's going to win the knight or the bishop. You go back, lose the bishop, you lose the game. But in this position, you can play bishop g4, attacking the tower on d1. And if white takes knight, you win the rook, and now you simply have a bunch of extra pawns here. And if white moves the rook to, let's just say, e1, very simply, you can go knight to e4. Now the bishop is not hanging on h3. And now black has a bishop and I believe 3 pawns for the rook. And with no open files here for the white rooks and an open file for the black rook, it's simply GG, why not? So instead, Magnus goes rook to c4, Pierre plays knight to e2, and now Magnus blunders again with this move rook takes c2. Now, one thing that I will be a little bit critical about in terms of Magnus Carlsen's games is I get the strong sense in these games he's trying very hard to pressure his opponents on the clock, get them low on time, and try to beat him. Now, that would also fit in with Magnus's modern stance, which is that he does not like classical chess. He only wants rapid and blitz tournaments. So at the end of the day, Magnus probably figures he's great in rapid and blitz. Let's try to get our opponents in that territory where there's little time, and if they have little time, they're more likely to blunder. But on the other hand, when you play like this, you yield, or not yield, you give away some of your accuracy, and you can make mistakes as well. So Magnus plays rook takes c2, Pierre plays rook takes d5, and now while black is still better here, and it looks like white has a lot of weaknesses, your knight is loose, white has an active rook, maybe the rook can swing to f3 later, and it's not simple to play. So Magnus goes knight to c5 so he doesn't hang the horse on e4. We get knight to d4 from Pierre, and now Magnus plays a classic blitz move from a Title Tuesday event, which is rook b2. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that with the last couple of moves, Magnus knows he's better. He's trying to get his opponent low on the clock, induce a blunder, and he plays what I would call our classic blitz move. Now, in this position, after rook to c4, hitting the pawn at a4, black is still quite a bit better, whereas in the game, after rook to b2, when Pierre finds this move queen to e1, which covers the b1 square and still guards the pawn at f2, suddenly black is in a lot of trouble here, and the main reason is white has this great active rook on the d file, but more importantly, white is lifting his rooks here with rook to f3 on the next turn. So computer thinks that black should force a draw with king f8, rook f3, queen e7, and we get a weird repetition with the game ending in a draw. Of course, Magnus Carlsen doesn't want to do that, and now Magnus blunders with this move bishop c6. Now again, Magnus trying to keep pressure on his opponent here. He's trying to play difficult moves without instant reaction moves from his opponent, but this is a big mistake because now Pierre swings the rook to f3 here. Magnus sacks the queen by taking the rook. If he were to move the queen back to d8, you lose the game here because white trades the knight for the bishop, sacks the rook for the knight on c5, and after dc5, queen e5 check, creating the attack, you have to move the king, queen b2, queen d1, and king g2. White simply has an extra rook on the board and will win the game. So Magnus goes bishop d5, rook takes queen, king takes rooks, and now Pierre finds the awesome tactic knight to f5. Now this is by far and away the best move in this position, because if you don't play knight to f5, Magnus probably thought, well, knight b5, just move the rook away, can't be that bad. But the danger, again, when you're moving fast, trying to pressure your opponent and not looking very concretely at the position, is sometimes you miss these tactics. Now, maybe Magnus needs to go and do some more puzzle rush. Maybe Bier has been hitting the puzzle rush trainer on chess.com very hard. Either way, Bier finds knight f5, and now Magnus is in a world of hurt. Now, you probably wonder, well, what's the big deal here? Why can't Magnus say move the rook to a2, for example? Because you see that if you take with the pawn, there's a check winning the rook. Why can't you go rook a2? If you play rook a2, there's queen e7 check, king takes knight, I check with the pawn, king f4, and uh-oh, spaghetti-o. Queen e3 is simply checkmate here. The black king has no squares. So black can't really move the rook away. You can't take with the pawn. So then there's the obvious question, well, why don't you just take with the king? Now, this is what does happen in the game. In fact, we get g4 check, and now Magnus, probably to his horror, realized that he can't move the king to either of these three squares. If you go to f4, we have the same checkmate with queen e3. If you go to g5, I go queen c1 check, picking up the rook on b2, and in the game, we get king f6, and now after queen c3, Bier is winning the rook here. And now we're in a situation where Magnus is a bishop and a knight for the queen. Now, luckily for Magnus, he has some play here. He's got two extra pawns, as well as the bishop and the knight for the queen, so it's not completely lost in this position. But what Magnus really is hoping here is he's able to push some p on the queen side before white can win the king side pawns and the game. So Magnus goes bishop to b3 here, and here Bier plays queen e2, king d5, and we get this move queen to f3. Now, as I was following this game live on my Kick channel, I actually thought that here white should play this move h4, and the reason is that even though black is going to try to push these pawns or win these pawns, if white is able to get a pawn to the end of the board quicker here, white will win the game. Now, computer actually does agree with me. It thinks that white is completely winning, and the reason is quite simple. Black's got to do something fast. You can't go b5 here, because even though white could take with the pawn, and I know the computer says it's winning, if you take with the pawn, there's a4, a3, a2, and with one passed pawn, maybe black can save the game. But if you play b5 here, white can take with the queen, knight is pinned after takes. Now with black only having the d pawn, it's going to be very hard to push the pawn up the board, and white should be able to win these kingside pawns with the powerful queen. And also just point one other thing. If black takes with a knight, you have queen f3 check, hitting the bishop, the king, and the pawn, and we have the classic box here. And black has to go king c4, guarding the bishop. And after queen f7, king c3, for example, here, white can simply take the pawn on h7, take on g6, push the p up the board, and win the game. So Bier instead plays this move queen f3. Keep in mind he is a little bit low on time. We get king e6, g5 played here. Now this is a move that I really don't like. If I were playing the situation, considering this is move number 39, I probably would have gone queen to e2 check and tried to come up with a better idea after king d5 on move number 40. Instead, Bier goes g5. Now Magnus plays king d7, and we're starting to see a little bit of a fortress setup here. The knight guards the pawn on b7, bishop on b3 here, and the king guards the pawn on d6. So black's position actually looks pretty stable. So Bier plays this move h4 here. Magnus goes king c7. Bier goes h5 here, realizing that if he loses this a4 pawn, black will push quickly, and if you don't create a pass pawn on the king side, you don't really have anything else to do. So Bier plays h5, we get takes, queen h5, and now b5 played here by Magnus, and now we have this move a takes b5, which is a big mistake. Now again, not easy to play this position for either side, to be fair, so you can't be too critical. Obviously I have a computer sitting next to me which can tell me the best moves, which makes it much easier for me. But after queen to e2, b takes a4 here, and queen b5, black does not get this pawn to a2, and it's very important here, because if I can just set this position up for a second, say you got some position like this, if the pawn gets to a2 here, it's one square away from queening, bishop always will guard the pawns, and black has chances to maybe even win the game. But in this position, after queen b5, black cannot go a3, because after takes, king d7, queen a3, now you have no passed a pawn, and white should win the game. So in this position here, queen e2 would have been for choice. Now it doesn't mean it was winning by force or anything, but it's what the computer wants. Instead, Bier takes, and now after king b6, we suddenly start to realize that Bier has no way to stop this pawn from pushing forward to a4, a3, and a2. It's simply unstoppable, and more importantly, bishop guards the pawn on f7 here. So even though white could take, for example, after a4, you're way too slow with this f pawn going up the board versus this passed a pawn. So BR plays queen e2, which is another mistake here. Probably he still should have taken on h7, and after a4, computer thinks that after queen to h1, apparently white is still winning this game, but very, very hard to play, because after king b5, queen e8, and king b4, it feels like black is going to be able to push his a pawn down the board. Now computer says after queen b8 and queen takes d6, it's still winning, but again, not easy to prove at all. So in this position, BR instead goes queen e2. Magnus plays a4 because he realizes that a pawn is what he's got to push down the board. BR plays queen to e8. Magnus goes a3, all in here. Of course, there's nothing else he can really do. If you allow queen c6 and queen d6, you just lose the game. So Magnus is banking on this a pawn to save the day. So we get queen c6, king to a5, queen to a8 played, and now we have king to b4 from Magnus, guarding the pawn on a3. BR goes b6, Magnus plays a2, we get b7, but now Magnus is able to sack the knight for the pawn here, and after queen b7 and king c3, suddenly the game is going to peter out to a draw here, because even though BR is an extra queen, Magnus has a bishop, a pawn that's one square away from queening, and white has no way to win the pawn. So we get queen a7, king b2, queen d4, king b1, and now BR has to make the repetition here. If he doesn't start checking, Magnus will get a queen, and with an extra bishop, he will win the game. So the game ends in a draw here after this repetition, which is a very, very lucky save for Magnus. Again, second game in the tournament against a much lower rated player where he's on the ropes, technically lost, but he's able to sneak his way out of it, draw the game, and avoid losing a lot of points. But more importantly, with this draw, Magnus luckily doesn't have the ignominy of being potentially not even the best player in Scandinavia. He still remains as the clear #1. So Magnus saves this game against a 26-33. He loses a couple of rating points with it, but he does not lose. So let's move to the game from today. So after drawing this tough game against Jonas B. Buell from Denmark yesterday, Magnus now has the white pieces against the first opponent in this event, who is rated 2700. Now unfortunately, that's most likely due to Norway not playing great as a team, but nonetheless, Magnus gets a chance to play a much stronger player and a chance to gobble up some all-important elo. So Magnus playing Jordan Van Forest. Now Van Forest is rated 2700 technically, however he has a very rough go of it. He's lost a lot of rating points in the Qatar Masters in Doha a month ago. He also had a very bad Grand Swiss as well. So Jordan Van Forest's rating, I believe, is somewhere around 2680 if I'm not mistaken, not actually 2700. So rough go of it, but probably he can turn it around here against Magnus. So we get e4 e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, bishop b5. Jordan plays knight f6, the classic Berlin defense, and this time Magnus castles. In round #1 against Jurgis Pechaz, Magnus played this move d4, a little bit rare, but this time around he decides to castle. We get knight takes e4, rook to e1, knight to d6 played, and now Magnus plays this move a4. Now there are many moves that white can play. Knight e5 is the main line. You have bishop f1, you've got a4, which I also have played, by the way, but most lines are considered to be pretty equal. So we get a4, bishop e7, Magnus goes knight to e6, knight to c3, we have a6 from Jordan, and now Magnus goes bishop f1. Of course, he does not trade the bishop for the knight, because even though black has double pawns, now black has the classic 2 Bs. So we got bishop f1, e4 played here, a good move to trade off a set of knights, and now after d5, black hopes to bring out his light square bishop. Magnus plays rook to e1, and now we have this move d4 being played by Jordan. The reason d4 is played as opposed to castling is that now after d4 and c3, for example, say h6 and c3, white maybe is a little bit better here. There's some pressure on the diagonals. It's not like it's winning or anything, but the computers do give white a significant advantage. So we get d4 from Van Forest. Magnus now plays the move bishop to d3. He does this instead of playing d3, because if white plays d3 while you open up the scope for the dark square bishop, where do you put this white bishop? Now of course down the road you could also fianchetto it via g2, but nonetheless bishop d3 is a very creative way. You want to get a nice wooden shield in the middle of the board, and then after you follow it up with bishop e4, you go d3 and then open up the scope for the dark square bishop. And most importantly, the bishop on e4 is simply a very active piece. So bishop d5 played by Van Forest. Magnus goes d3, we get castles, bishop to f4, trying to pressure the pawn on c7. Van Forest goes bishop b4, we get rook to e2, we have rook to c8 being played here to guard the pawn on c7. Important move here, because if white plays, let's just say a5, after takes and bishop c7, white simply has an extra pawn. So in this position we get rook to c8, Magnus plays bishop d2, we get bishop to e7, and now this move queen to e1. Now of course Magnus could go bishop f4, bishop b4 and make a draw, but considering Magnus is losing a couple of points, that is not his goal. So Magnus goes queen to e1, lines up the double stack here, hoping to put some pressure on the e file. Jordan trades the bishops on e4, goes f5 here. Now f5 is a move that I don't really like here because it creates some weaknesses. Now the rook can always go to like e6 potentially. Feels like down the road this pawn could be targeted as well. In this position, if I were playing, probably I would just go queen d7, rook to e8, and bishop f8 if possible. Instead we get f5. Magnus plays rook e2. Now Jordan plays bishop to f6, trying to overprotect this pawn on d4 here and not hang anything on the e file. Now we get b4 from Magnus, which is a move to try and expand on the queen side. If white can get b5 here, the knight is in some trouble. The pawn on d4 a little bit weak, but more importantly, you also potentially open up a new diagonal for your dark square bishop as well. So we get queen to d5 being played here by Jordan Van Forest. Magnus plays h4 here, a move to create Lufthansa for the king with king h2, but also stop g5. And if black ever goes h6 here, maybe down the road white can play h5 to fix the pawn structure. So Jordan does play h6 in fact, and now Magnus goes bishop to f4 here, trying to repressure the pawn on c7. G5 not playable here, and waiting for a reply. So we get king to h7. Now Magnus plays queen to d2 with the idea of double stacking on the e file. After queen d2 we have rook fe8, and now Magnus plays the move rook takes rook. We get rook takes rook and bishop c7 played here. Now you're probably thinking, well, wait, what is Van Forest doing? He's lost a pawn here, he's in trouble. But computer actually says that here black is still okay because of the move that Van Forest plays, which is this move bishop to e7, pressuring the pawn on b4. Now if white were to go rook to b1 to try and guard the pawn here, black is queen to a2, hitting the rook, hitting the pawn, and suddenly after rook b3, queen a4, the pawn on b4 remains weak. Now you're in some danger of maybe even losing the game. Computer says queen f4 is equal, but that's beside the point. So we get b5 here from Magnus. Jordan trades and takes on b5, and Magnus goes queen f4. Now what has happened here is we've had a transformation to where material is even, but when you look at this position with a full lens or full view, you'll notice that black has a ton of weaknesses. You've got a weak pawn on b7, weak pawn on f5, weak pawn on d4 as well. For example, say you get queen c5, rook b1, just to illustrate. All of these pawns are very, very weak. White really is one weakness, maybe the pawn on c2, but 3 is greater than 1, so 3 weaknesses are much more dangerous. So in this position, we have the move bishop f6 being played by Van Forest. Magnus goes h5 here, fixing the pawn structure. Now black never go g5, because if you go g5, there's a classic maneuver end peasant with pawn takes pawn, also known as the chess glitch, and white is much better. So we get king g8 from Van Forest. Magnus goes queen d6 here, and now we have the move f4 being played. A little bit of a desperation move, I would say here, playing f4 here. Computer says after knight to e5 black is still fine, but it's a very hard move to play, or I should say to see the tactical idea with knight d4, queen b2, rook f1, takes check, takes, and maybe black can draw the game. Again, tough move to find, not easy, and Van Forest instead plays f4, hoping they can trade off one of his weaknesses in return for the pawn on h5. So Magnus says no, he plays queen d7. Van Forest takes the pawn, but now Magnus is able to take on f4, and suddenly we see that white's queen is very active. There's rook to b1 incoming, and black is really struggling. So Van Forest goes queen to f7, Magnus trades, and now he goes rook to b1. Now you're probably thinking, well, white should be a little bit better, but probably you can draw. Now I would say in most cases I'd expect this to be a draw, but the player with the white piece is the greatest endgame player to have ever lived, Magnus Carlsen. And on top of that, you have 2 weaknesses, but white can also try to create a bastion via knight d2 to e4 or to c4. So we get king f1 from Magnus. Van Forest plays g5. We get bishop to h2. Now we have rook d7, and Magnus plays this move g4. An excellent move here for a couple of reasons. First of all, it stops black from pushing p. Secondly, much more importantly, it fixes these pawns on the same color as the white bishop on h2. So in an endgame, if we ever get to some endgame, just to illustrate it, I'm just going to hang some pieces here, so never mind me, you guys. But let's just say you get to some endgame like this, for example. White is actually completely winning in this endgame because 3 of the pawns for black are on the same color as this white dark square bishop. So in this position, probably h5 or g4 should have been played to avoid the situation, but we end up here with g4, and now Van Forest goes king g6. Magnus plays rook to b5, trying to prevent this h5 pawn push, because after h5 is played, takes, maybe you think there's some kind of tactic. Now, this is the game. Magnus goes king g2, bishop f4 on first glance looks good, but now black has this nice move, knight to a7, hitting the rook here. You move away, spaghetti-o, there goes the bishop. If you go rook c5, I have b6 for example, rook f5, and after king g6 here, white will lose some material. So in this position, Magnus goes king g2, keeping the two weaknesses for black, or I should say 3 weaknesses. All 3 pawns are weak. Van Forest goes king g6. Now Magnus starts to reroute the pony either to the c4 or e4 squares. Additionally, on top of that, when we look at the position, white has no weaknesses. Black cannot target the pawns. The knight and the bishop are completely fine. So black has a bunch of weaknesses here. And as we say in the game of chess, one of the most common themes that is known is that, generally speaking, it's considered that if you have one weakness, you can defend that one weakness and save the game. If you have 2 weaknesses or more, generally you should be losing from a technical standpoint. So Van Forest with 3 big weaknesses here, and white having no weaknesses at all, means that technically it should be very good for white. So we get knight to a7. Magnus goes rook b2, a nice move, retreating, pressuring the pawn, but also guarding the pawn on c2. Knight c6 back is played, and now we have the move knight to c4 from Magnus, and now it's starting to get very dangerous because there are also ideas like knight to d6, trying to win this pawn on b7. So in this position, we get the move g4 from Van Forest. Magnus goes rook to b5, stopping black from putting anything on this 5th rank, and now we have rook e7. After rook e7, bishop d6 played here by Magnus, rook h7 played by Van Forest, and now Magnus goes knight d2 back with the intention of putting the knight on e4. Now the reason he's going to put the knight on e4 here potentially is that if the knight gets to e4 down the road, say you get the knight here, white can simply walk the king up the board, collect this pawn on g4 now, and win the game. Whereas before, when the pawn was back on g5, if you put this knight, let's just illustrate it, something like this, you'll notice that in this position, if we get here, and I know white's much better, but just to illustrate it, the pawn on g5 is actually not a weakness. You can't just win this pawn right away. So in this position, we get this knight d2 move played, knight a7 played by Jordan. We get rook to b1, king f5 played, and now Magnus goes knight to e4, creating the classic connect 4, but also he has this great bastion for the horse on e4. After knight to e4, Van Forest plays bishop e5, which loses on the spot. Bishop d8, the computer says, is still playable, but again, after a move like bishop g3, king e6, and knight c5, white's going to win at least a pawn here. Say you got something like this. Both these pawns are still weak. White can create another bastion on e4, and from a practical standpoint, I don't think any human could save this position. So we get bishop e5 played by Van Forest, bishop takes bishop, king takes bishop, and now Magnus plays king to g3. Now Magnus here is completely winning for the simple reason that he intends to win the pawn on g4. Pawn on b7 is still weak. Knight on a7 can't ever move. Say you go knight c6, there's check, king e6, knight g5, forking the king and the rook, and you lose the game immediately. So after king g3, we get rook g7, trying to guard the pawn on g4. Magnus plays rook to b6, a very nice zugzwang move here, because now if you move the knight, again, there's going to be a check on b5. If you move the rook to, say, f7, now I just gobble on g4. So Jordan plays rook to c7, but now Magnus can take this pawn anyway, because if black tries to even out the material by capturing, there's f4 checking the king, king d5, and after rook d6, this is simply checkmate. The rook and the knight and the pawn combine to checkmate the black king. There are no squares available here. So Van Forest plays rook to f7 instead, trying to stop f4. Now Magnus goes f3 here. We get rook to f4, king to g3, rook to f7, and after this very nice move, f4, Jordan Van Forest resigns the game here for a couple of reasons. First of all, if you go king f5, there's knight d6, forking the king and the rook. Takes. We have a kebab on the 7th. White has an extra rook, a bunch of extra pawns, and it's GG on the spot. If you go king d5, again, there's rook d6 with the checkmate here, so you can't do that either. And if you take this pawn on f4, white plays rook takes b7, attacking the horse. You'd love to go back, but then I gobble your rook. And when you move the knight to c6, I have rook b5 check. King's got to go. I win the rook, and I win the game. So Magnus wins this game. A very impressive technical display of positional understanding and endgame grind to beat Jordan Van Forest. And with that, Magnus Carlsen is again back in the green, I believe. I think he is now finally gaining a few rating points, or maybe gaining 1 or 2. I haven't actually checked the list, so I could be wrong on that, but he should gain some juicy rating points for beating a 2,700 rated player. And with that, Magnus wins a nice game. So Magnus, a little bit of a choppy turn. He's drawn a couple of games against the lower rated players. He finally gets a 2,700 level player, wins a perfect game with the white pieces, and he moves on to play tomorrow. So tomorrow will be the 9th and final round of the European Team Championship. If Magnus wins the game, he will almost certainly gain points. If he draws, he probably loses rating points. Nonetheless, he has had a pretty good event overall, and we'll see what happens in his final round and the final match for the Norwegian team, which has struggled a lot throughout this event. So on that note, I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap from the European Team Championship of the games with the 5-time former world chess champion Magnus Carlsen. Make sure to smash that subscribe button below if you haven't already, and I will be back soon with some more great YouTube only content. Have a great rest of your weekend, you guys, and see you soon. Bye.